So we come now to consider this proclamation to the church in Thyatira. And if we're following that sort of trade route, which we saw on a map, then we've gone some 50 miles further along from Pergamum. And unlike some of the other cities that we've seen, Thyatira is in relative terms nothing special. Rather, it's a city full of various trades. And these trade guilds include material or fabric dyers. And if we remember back to Acts chapter 16 and verse 14, if I can find it, when Paul and his companions are in Philippi, we read in Acts 16 and verse 14, one of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira. And so they're traveling around and trading. So there's dyers there, there's wool merchants, linen workers, coppersmiths, leather cutters, potters, and so on. It's a huge industrial city. And each of these trades would have had its own guild. And these workers' guilds would have been meeting or groups where there was a huge overlap between work life, civic life, family life, religious life, and so on, all mixed together. And so these trade guilds started to develop and became akin to sort of meetings of cultic worship. Food sacrifice to idols, sexual immorality, all those sorts of things. And again, we've seen some of that as we've gone through some of the letters in the New Testament. We saw something of that, particularly as Paul writes to the Corinthian church. If we were to go back to 1 Corinthians chapters 8, 9, and 10, we'd see him talking to them about how to cope with that situation. And so in Thyatira, to work meant almost certainly being part of a trade guild. And so these things were difficult, if not impossible, to avoid. And so what we see here is that in Thyatira, the temptation and the persecution is much more from the sort of the social economic sphere of life, whereas in Pergamum, the focus was much more from the sort of political sphere, emperor worship and so on. So again, we just see the temptation and the persecution that the church is facing and something of the subtlety of it. And Jesus says, I know your deeds, your love, your faith, your perseverance, your service. I know how you are living, and I know your motivation for living. And I know that you are growing in this, growing in maturity and so on. And having heard that, the but then comes as quite a blow. But, and I guess these words remind us today, even if we think or when we think we're doing okay, then we must never become too self-assured or too complacent. And what we see is a contrast here between the words to the church in Ephesus and the church here in Thyatira. Ephesus had lost its first love. Thyatira's love had grown stronger. And yet, on the other hand, Ephesus did not tolerate wicked people, whereas Thyatira does. And the wickedness is personified in the words, that woman Jezebel. Now, one of the things we don't know is whether this is a reference to a specific person in Thyatira, or if it's a reference to Queen Jezebel, queen of King Ahab. And we see that in 1 Kings chapter 19. And Jezebel then, in 1 Kings, sought effectively to try and systematically destroy God's people. But what we do see, even if we don't know if this is a person or just a reference to Jezebel, what we do see is a sort of an allusion to what we might term personality cults. Again, possibly linked with those trade guilds. And again, this false teaching has seeped into the life of the church causing all types of problems. And yet, amazingly, what we see in this letter that we don't really see in the others is a glimpse of God's grace. In verse 21, I have given them time, I've given them opportunity to repent. And yet, unwilling to do so, her punishment and that of her followers is cruel indeed. And although we read it described in physical terms, the indication is much more in spiritual terms, that sort of exclusion and isolation from God. But to those who do not follow this teaching, to those who overcome, the promise is twofold. Firstly, there is authority to rule over or to shepherd. And we see in verse 27 this reference to an iron scepter. Sounds really cruel. Dash them to pieces like pottery. And we'll see this theme developed and opened out as we go through this book of Revelation. Those sort of quoted verses there, 27, we'll see them recurring in chapter 12 and also chapter 19 of Revelation. And in their context, we need to remember that in Thyatira, they're currently under the harsh authority of secular forces. But we know John attributes these physical forces to sort of being brought about or influenced by spiritually dark forces. And so John is seeing this as these dark forces are trying to crush the church. But these spiritually dark forces will not win out, is what John is saying. They themselves will be crushed, this idea of authority over. At the moment, the church may feel like it's under the authority of. But John says the church will ultimately have authority. Ultimately, it will prevail. And we see echoes of this sort of turn of events. If you look at Psalm 2, Genesis 3, just after the fall, this idea of authority, God's authority and rule being reimposed or reclaimed, if that makes sense. And then secondly, we see there's this thing about being given the morning star. Now, some people, it's very easy to think, actually, the morning star sometimes refers to Satan, the morning star fallen, etc., etc. But here, most would see this as referring back to Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17, where we see written, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the sons of Seth. And again, it's this, although quite gruesome sounding, what we see is the reference to God's ultimate rule and reign. And as we go through Revelation, from chapter 4 onwards, we'll just start to see how that opens out. And again, if we bring it back to its context, here are the churches suffering very much under secular influence, political influence from Rome, emperor worship, and all these things. And the church just feels under all of this, the weight of all of this. And John reminds them that ultimately God will be victorious, even if at the moment we might not feel that.